Comenzamos Visión Global. Hola, buenas tardes. Comenzamos repasando las noticias más importantes del día. Las ganancias de Morgan Stanley superan las estimaciones gracias al auge de los acuerdos empresariales. Un auge mundial de acuerdos ha impulsado la banca de inversión y la mayor actividad comercial ha elevado su división de valores institucionales. Morgan Stanley es uno de los principales bancos de inversión de Wall Street. Su beneficio neto aumenta un 150% a 3.980 millones de euros. Las ganancias del primer trimestre del Bank of New York Mellon caen, pero superaron las expectativas, al igual que el resto de bancos. La compañía ha liberado provisiones a lo largo del trimestre. El beneficio neto cae un 9% a 858 millones de dólares en comparación con el mismo periodo del año anterior. Sin embargo, comparado con el trimestre previo, sube un 22%. Los ingresos caen un 5% a 3.920 millones de dólares. El banco ha liberado 83 millones de dólares de sus provisiones para pérdidas crediticias, basándose en la mejora de las perspectivas de la economía americana. La inflación de la eurozona repunta al 1,3% en marzo, desde el 0,9% de febrero, el mayor incremento de los precios desde enero del 2020, nivel previo a la pandemia. La subida se ha debido al impacto de los precios de la energía, que en marzo del 2021 se apreció un 4,3% interanual, según Eurostat. Los alimentos frescos se encarecieron un 1,6% y los servicios un 1,3% interanual. China creció un 18,3% en el primer trimestre, ligeramente por debajo de las expectativas. Decepcionó la producción industrial, pero las ventas al por menor batieron las previsiones. Las expectativas eran de un aumento del 19%. El aumento del crecimiento se produce tras una contracción en el primer trimestre del año pasado, cuando la economía se redujo un 6,8% durante el apogeo del brote del COVID-19. Moody's asegura que el plan de recuperación del gobierno tendrá un impacto positivo en la calificación crediticia de España. La agencia de medición valida los ejes de actuación del plan, que centra las inversiones en sectores clave como la transición ecológica y digital. Moody's asegura que el programa español supondrá un refuerzo al crecimiento económico del país, aunque advierte de que dependerá de su puesta en marcha eficaz. El indicador de confianza empresarial armonizado subió un 5% en el segundo trimestre del año en relación al trimestre anterior. Con la subida de la confianza en el segundo trimestre, este indicador acumula 3 trimestres consecutivos en positivo, después del avance del 10,5% que se registró en el último cuarto del 2020, hasta ahora el mayor de la serie. Y el consumo de cemento sube un 8% en el primer trimestre del 2021, hasta alcanzar la producción solo en marzo de 1,4 millones de toneladas. Esta cifra supera en un 9,3% la registrada en el mismo mes del 2019, antes de la pandemia. Supone la mayor producción en marzo de los últimos 5 años. Las ventas online se disparan un 65% en España en el primer trimestre del año. El tráfico digital en este periodo ha crecido un 27% en todo el mundo y un 50% en España, el porcentaje más alto desde el inicio de la pandemia. El 74% de los pedidos online se realizan desde el móvil. Y es hora de conectar con México con nuestro compañero José Ricardo Rangel. José Ricardo, ¿qué tal? Buenas tardes.
¿Qué tal? Muy buenas tardes, Manuel. Buenas tardes allá en España, buenos días aquí en México y pues como siempre a mitad de la sesión, mi querido Manuel, rapidísimamente cómo está el mercado. Estamos en terrenos positivos con punto 34 arriba en el índice de precios y cotizaciones y principalmente pues con esta noticia que desde el día martes estamos tratando de analizar de la posible fusión que va a tener tanto Televisa como Univisión y pues hoy la acción precisamente de Televisa está a 4.20 arriba, se está recuperando del día de ayer que tuvo una contracción de igual forma del 4%. Debemos estar muy atentos a los fundamentales de esta empresa porque pues seguramente va a seguir teniendo estos periodos de volatilidad y bueno, destaco también aparte de Sports World que pues ellos a pesar de la situación que no está tan formalizada la fusión o la colaboración con Smart City, que es Smart City se llama la empresa de acá de deportes, pues ha tenido poco a poco esa tendencia. Yo creo que vamos a ver en el análisis técnico una tendencia alcista de esta acción próximamente con esta recuperación. Y bueno, sin más preámbulos, mi querido Manuel, vámonos con nuestro invitado porque vamos a ver precisamente modelos de inversión, digámoslo así, y bueno, algo sofisticado y pues también con su debido riesgo. Vámonos, Manuel.
Edgar Arenas, buenas tardes.
¿Qué tal? Muy buena tarde allá en España, buenos días aquí en México y en América.
Muchas gracias por estar en Negocios Televisión, Edgar. Hoy vamos a hablar un poco del mercado de capitales. ¿Qué es un CFDs?
Bueno, este tipo de vehículos de inversión, Manuel, Ricardo, toda la gente que nos ve y nos escucha, son un activo de inversión muy sofisticado, no es para todo mundo, aunque a últimas fechas quienes utilizamos nuestras redes sociales como Twitter, como Facebook, hemos visto de forma regular que nos llegan algunos anuncios muy puntuales y muy llamativos, ¿no? Una modelo rubia en traje de baño que en la parte de atrás dice: invierte en Amazon y obtendrás un segundo sueldo. Y uno voltea y ve este tipo de anuncios. ¿A qué te invitan a invertir? A invertir en CFDs, que es la abreviatura en castellano de contratos por diferencia. No es un activo de inversión con un marco regulatorio acorde al mercado de capitales o al mercado de bonos, al mercado de deuda. Está mucho más apegado a un contrato derivado, que también están fuera, en el caso de México, del marco regulatorio del mercado mexicano de derivados llamado MexDer. En castellano, ¿qué hace? ¿No? Tratando de diluir toda esta parte técnica. Un contrato por diferencia no es un título, es literalmente un contrato que tiene como un activo subyacente, es decir, que deriva de otro instrumento y que funciona en base a valorización de compra y venta del contrato. La intención será comprarlo más barato de lo que lo vendemos, o si queremos hacer una operación en corto, jugarle un poco al valiente a que el mercado va a bajar, primero vendemos y luego compramos cuando está más barato. Los CFDs tienen un abanico gigantesco de activos subyacentes de donde derivan los contratos. Lo mismo hay CFDs de acciones que CFDs de commodities. Un commodity es un activo físico, como puede ser el oro, la plata, el platino, algún tipo de grano, el litio, el petróleo, o a últimas fechas, incluso las criptodivisas. Hay CFDs vinculados, derivados del precio del Bitcoin, el Ethereum, y ya un largo, etcétera. Manuel, Ricardo, los CFDs ganan en periodos cortos la muy activa volatilidad que tienen estos contratos ligados al subyacente, porque cuando invierten en un CFD, lo que hacemos es apalancarnos. Es decir, por cada dólar que depositamos ahí, podemos obtener ganancias por $10 o más. Hay apalancamientos de 1 a 20, 1 a 50, 1 a 100. Y cuando el mercado va para arriba, todo está fantástico, porque no ganas sobre el dólar, ganas sobre el nivel del apalancamiento. Lo mismo ganar sobre 1 que sobre 10. Cada quien hace cuentas. Pero ¿qué pasa cuando el mercado va a la baja? Es un problema, porque si pusimos $1 y apalancamos 10 y el mercado baja un 10%, perdemos la totalidad del dólar. En Europa, de hecho, estos activos que nacieron en la década de los 50, pero que hoy en el mercado donde nacieron, que es Estados Unidos, están prohibidos, democratizaron mucho la inversión en pequeños y medianos inversiones en el viejo continente. Aunque las autoridades allá en España, de hecho, en cada página que vende CFDs, la ley los obliga a poner una leyenda que más o menos dice textual: entre un 70 y 80% de la gente, el inversionista retail, el inversionista chiquito, que pone dinero ahí, pierde capital. Entonces no está mal que invirtamos ahí, pero hay que entender los pros y sobre todo hay que entender los contras.
Oye, Edgar, muy importante el saber qué tipo de inversionista. Ya lo hemos platicado muchísimas veces, el perfil de inversionista para ti que tú eres especialista en fondos de inversión y que pues literal tienes que analizar a cada uno de tus clientes tal cual sus necesidades. En este caso, ¿cómo podría identificar el inversionista si es viable o no viable para él el invertir su dinero en este tipo de activos, Edgar?
Creo que es muy fácil, Ricardo. Es importante definir tu perfil. Y el perfil agresivo embona perfectamente con este tipo de instrumentos, aunque yo haría una gran observación. Este tipo de activos no son activos direccionados a un horizonte de largo plazo. Quien quiere invertir con un horizonte de largo plazo, muy teoría buffettiana, inversión en valor, hoy compra Apple, hoy compra otro activo y que me digan, lo tiene guardadito ahí con una visión más de socio empresarial de esa empresa, es activo de muchos años. El que invierte en CFDs lo que quiere es una ganancia grande, una rentabilidad grandota en un periodo corto. El inversionista en CFDs debe de tener dos características entonces: buscar ganancias en periodos cortos, en base a un conocimiento técnico amplio, hay que saberle. Y segundo, hay que estar literalmente pegado a la pantalla todo el día. En el momento en el que tú inviertes en un CFD, te vas a pegar a tu teléfono o a tu computadora, porque si el mercado te juega en contra y tú te habías ido a preparar un tecito a la cocina, pues ese tiempo, esos minutos, te pudieron haber costado mucho dinero. Y cuando uno invierte, lo que quiere es ganar, no perder.
Oye, Edgar, y sobre todo, a ver, estamos hablando del análisis técnico, pero supongo que dependerá también el subyacente, como bien lo comentaste, pues el nivel de análisis fundamental, ¿no? O sea, no, porque veo que este tipo de inversionistas hablan mucho se mueven sobre el análisis técnico, yo creo que en el 80%, pero también la posibilidad del fundamental es algo que no debemos de dejar pues detrás, ¿no, Edgar?
Me parece que es correcto, Ricardo. Estamos muy próximos a estar en temporada, hoy estamos en temporada de reportes, y para un inversionista sofisticado que se hace cargo de su propio patrimonio, le dedica tiempo, es indispensable dedicarle tiempo a hacer gráficas. El técnico, el analista técnico, es un chartista, como decimos en el argot, y se tiene que complementar con meterse al estómago de los estados contables de resultados, de ventas de las empresas, del activo. que aquí recordemos que no compras el activo, no compramos la acción. Cuando compramos una acción, Ricardo, también hay que hacerle entender a la gente esto. Tú adquieres derechos sobre la acción. Principalmente son derechos corporativos y derechos patrimoniales. Un derecho corporativo es por cada acción un voto, un derecho patrimonial es dividendos, el más común, ¿no? Pero cuando tú compras un CFD, no estás adquiriendo los derechos patrimoniales y corporativos de la acción. Es un contrato entre dos partes. El formador, que puede ser el que está vendiendo el CFD, el banco o la institución, el intermediario que lo creó, y tú. El mercado de valores es diferente. De un lado está el vendedor y del otro lado está el comprador. Es un mercado estandarizado. En el mercado de CFDs no hay un mercado estandarizado. Es un contrato entre dos, ¿vale? No te liga la oferta y la demanda como en el caso de una acción o un bono.
Oye, Edgar, pero esto es importantísimo lo que acabas de decir. Creo que va muy ad hoc con lo que nos comentabas desde un inicio. Es para entender, es un mercado fuera de lo que le nombran, creo que offshore. No está regulado por lo que entiendo, por lo menos en regulación mexicana, este mercado MEXDER de derivados no pertenece ahí. Pertenece a una persona regulada en no sé dónde, ¿no? Y ese contrato es entre esa persona y tú, sí, el que abre la inversión. Entonces, no hay como que tampoco un derecho per se de este subyacente, ¿no? O sea, el subyacente, pues ahí está y no puedo, digamos que, voltearme a Amazon y cobrar mi acción, ¿no?
Es correcto, tú no puedes llegar y decirle a Jeff Bezos, oye, tengo una acción tuya y tengo derechos de suscripción, que es básicamente si emites más acciones, yo tengo prioridad para adquirirlas, o tengo un derecho de dividendo, si tú generas dividendos, me das una acción y me das más dinero. En un contrato, en un CFD, no es así. Los CFDs en México no están regulados. Cuando vemos esta publicidad, lo que generalmente pasa cuando metes, ingresas tus datos, es que alguien en Centroamérica, por ejemplo, aquí pasó alguna vez que ya llamaron de Belice, ¿no? Ahí es donde tenían los datos. Y bueno, pues allá la regulación lo permite, pero aquí en México no. Entonces, bueno, si yo un día me quiero ir a pelear a Belice, pues tengo que ir a pelearme con las leyes de allá, no con las leyes mexicanas. Es un mercado extra bursátil. Y al hablar de derivados, se le llama OTC, over the counter, sobre el mostrador. Son contratos no estandarizados, en donde el comprador y el vendedor se ponen de acuerdo sin que haya un mercado de por medio.
Oye, Edgar, y sobre todo ahorita que se está pues poniendo, digamos que de moda aquí en México, como bien dices, a cada rato envían este tipo de información y vaya este millonario en 2 días. ¿Qué le recomendarías finalmente a nuestra audiencia y sobre todo que pues tenemos personas jóvenes que pues están pues ávidos de querer invertir? ¿Qué perfil o más bien, ¿qué recomendación les harías para que pudieran acceder a este tipo de instrumentos y cuáles serían los riesgos?
Bueno, mira, el mercado de CFDs es muy grandote en el mundo. Gestionan diariamente, no es una cifra oficial porque tampoco ha de haber un mercado estandarizado, no tenemos la manera de medirlo de forma precisa, pero más o menos se calcula que 90,000 millones de dólares se gestionan en transacciones diariamente en este mercado. Pero de esos 90,000 millones de dólares, imagínate cuánto es el 80% de lo que la gente regularmente pierde. Si tú vas a involucrarte en este tipo de activos, ten muy presente que es dinero que si lo pierdes, no te vas a quedar sin comer. Si tú pierdes el dinero en este tipo de instrumentos, no vas a perder la oportunidad de pagar la hipoteca de tu casa o lo que estés pagando de tu carro. Si tienes muy presente que es una inversión especulativa, y como especulación hay posibilidades de pérdida, involúcrate e involúcrate con conocimiento. Los jóvenes, no, con este tema de la inversión digital, con tanto dinero en el mundo que se ha inyectado por parte de los bancos centrales, un poquito con el ocio de ver qué me llega a mi teléfono, a mi red social, se encuentran esto y dicen, venga, le voy a entrar. Y no está mal que le entren. Lo que está mal es que le entren sin saber. Si aprendes, conoces los pros y contras, involúcrate, pero no se vale entrarle a algo de lo que desconoces. Bien dice Warren Buffett, el mayor riesgo en invertir está en no saber en qué estás invirtiendo.
Pues mi querido Edgar, muchísimas gracias por tu tiempo. De verdad que atesorable la información que nos has dado, sobre todo para tomar las medidas correspondientes al momento de que nos lleguen estos anuncios y checar, pues ahora sí, todo de pe a pa. Edgar Arenas, muchísimas gracias. Le mandamos un fuerte saludo, Manuel. Felicidades a todo el equipo de Negocios TV que ayer se lucieron con una chulada de debate económico para todo el tema de elecciones allá en Madrid. Muchísimas felicidades a todo el equipo, les mandamos un fuerte abrazo. Edgar Arenas, muchísimas gracias, te mando un fuerte abrazo aquí desde México.
Un abrazo, Ricardo, un abrazo por allá en España a todo el mundo.
Muchas gracias, mi querido José Ricardo. Edgar, gracias a todos. Buenas tardes.
Buenas tardes, Manuel. Hasta lunes.
Hasta lunes. Pues vemos ahora la entrevista que ha hecho nuestra corresponsal en Estados Unidos, Visila Bococo, que habla de la investigación de mercados y marketing. Vemos esa entrevista, pero nosotros volvemos el próximo lunes. Buenas tardes. Adiós.
Welcome to Global Vision. Today is with us Stacy de Armas, and we're going to speak about collectivist culture, terms that for some of us we're not familiar with, and the trends in all of this culture. So I would love to just first of all welcome you to Global Vision.
Thank you so much. Gracias. Thank you for having me. I look forward to talking all things about Latinos, Hispanics, US and abroad.
Wonderful. Tell me a little bit about your background.
Well, my name is Stacy de Armas. My family comes from Cuba. However, I think as I mentioned to you before, my grandfather's family come from Galicia. And but my grandfather and my family are mostly from Cuba and came to the United States in the 1960s. I grew up with a very bicultural upbringing. I've had a really wonderful opportunity being in the US and being exposed to a lot of different types of Latin culture. In particular, I live in Los Angeles, and Los Angeles is largely dominated by Mexican culture and Mexicanos, and among other groups. And so it has really been, a wonderful blending of culture, at least for me and my personal upbringing in the US. I kind of fell into a focus of our community, all right, of Latinidad, and of in particular, I focus on Latinos as consumers, and it just kind of happened by chance. It's sort of an interesting story. If we get down that path, I started seeing it become important to me and showing itself in my work really early on. I mean, when I was in college, and this became a passion for me, and it led me down this road to where now I have this area of expertise, and it's a real pleasure.
And what is for you multicultural media research? Because of your background and the way you grew up, you end up in this field, and it's interesting the process. How did you get to this field, and what that means, and what it means also diverse consumer behavior? Because for some of us are terms that are very new.
Yeah, so how it happened was, as I was sort of alluding to it in the first question, it really happened sort of by accident, but it was through following my passion. So as I said, I grew up in Los Angeles, and when I was in college, I started working when I was in high school. I started working very young. My first few jobs were in the restaurant business. You know, I was a hostess or I was a waitress. And I found early on, I felt a real connection with, at the time, sort of the back of the house. You know, it was largely populated by Latinos, but the teams that I worked with, the cooks and the people, you know, they were my people and my culture, and we, you know, it felt like very comfortable. I also noticed early on that, you know, this particular group of people weren't really treated with equity, right? And this is me in high school at a restaurant, but still noticing that there was this real disparity in equity between how we were treated, how we were scheduled, and our expectations. But of course, I was a kid, so, you know, I advocated a little bit where I could. I remember one instance in particular where there's a job in the restaurant that's called an expo. And your job is you take the plates from the cook and then you put the different, you know, like the decorations on them, whatever, and then you take them out. And that job is typically not held by, you know, a waitress or a host. It's a different role. But one of my friends had something he needed to do. I don't remember what it was. So I offered to take that role. I said, I'll take your shift for you. And I remember it being like a big deal that there was this sort of coming, you know, between like the back of the house and the front of the house. And I was like, I remember feeling like, who cares? You know, but at the time there were these really distinct lines. So that's very early in my career. But the point is, I started to see this inequity. Later, I went to work, still in college, at a bank. And I worked in a predominantly Hispanic area. We had a lot of Latinos that were new immigrants, some that weren't, but largely Hispanic. And I noticed through my work, again, at the bank, and I was just, you know, young still, not in advertising and marketing yet, but I was working at the bank, and there were many people that came in at the time that were either underbanked or didn't quite yet understand the financial system as it worked in the US. It's different in every country, right? Regardless of education, no matter how educated you are, wherever you go, every banking system is sort of somewhat different. So my role was opening new accounts and helping people understand, you know, how to cash their checks, et cetera. But I noticed, again, for this particular group of clients, there was like inequity. There was, you know, they would have to spend exorbitant amounts of money to cash checks or couldn't open accounts or whatever. So I found a way through loopholes to kind of angle around those responsibilities and help this particular group of people become banked, right? Help them navigate the financial system. But again, that was just sort of natural. I spoke Spanish, my clients spoke Spanish. I had actually recently come back from spending about a year in Spain. Interesting. So at that particular time, so I was really passionate about connecting with the culture in this way. And so, you know, this was my area of focus at the bank. I just started focusing on helping these clients in a different way than we were helping our non-Spanish speaking clients. Fast forward, and I'm telling you this because it really is part of how I ended up taking this area of focus. I started working at an advertising agency. I graduated from college. I started working at an advertising agency. And, you know, sort of the same thing. I noticed that we were placing Spanish language buys and we were evaluating Spanish language stations in both television and radio and cable. And we didn't have a good understanding of what we were actually placing media in. So, Misila, I remember asking, I was very, very new to the agency, but I remember asking, well, you know, they sent us a list of programming. We can evaluate this content. We can understand what it was. And again, I had, you know, at that time, a lot of the content was shared between Mexico and Spain. And, you know, the content wasn't necessarily produced in the US, but it was all Spanish language content. It wasn't difficult to understand, you know, what the premises were. So I started evaluating that and then going back to my boss and saying, well, you know, here's what this is and here's where we should be. Nothing really advanced. But quickly, I became this expert in Spanish language content, right? And I was very young and new, but it was really just, you know, it sort of evolved because I had an interest and a passion in this space. So that really, you know, that created the space for me to become an expert in Spanish language content and Spanish language audiences. And to grow with the industry, this was in the late 90s and the early 2000s, to really grow with the industry as we started to understand not only about the value of the content, but the value of the consumer that's consuming that content, right? The value of Spanish language consumer. But I tell you this long story of like working as a waitress and working at a bank and then working in advertising, because when I look back, I can see I always had this passion for this particular community, to tell the story of these people, whatever it is, right? And of course, the story of Mexicanos in LA is very different from the story of, you know, Argentinians in Miami. They're very different stories, very different backgrounds, but it gave me the opportunity to really understand this consumer, and not only this consumer, but the cultural anthropology behind each of these consumers that drives their decisions. So that's what that is. Diverse consumer behavior is what I focus on now, which is a culmination of all of that work. So that means that I try to understand specifically for Spanish-speaking consumers from a variety of different countries, right? Dominicano, doesn't matter where the consumer's from, but try and understand the uniquenesses about this consumer and what drives their behaviors, whether, you know, how they consume content, how they choose content to watch, how they make purchases, why they make those purchases. And that why is different for everybody. I mean, we all know, you know, again, another example, Cubanos in Miami they make decisions differently than perhaps, you know, Dominicanos from Nueva York. Everyone makes different decisions based on their personal histories and experiences with culture. And so I specialized in understanding that and then bringing that to businesses.
Well, that's
a long answer.
No,
I'm
but
sorry,
I love it because it's fascinating. In this way, we could see how this evolved to be your career, which I think is very interesting. And what do you do in Nielsen? What is this company? What it does exactly?
So Nielsen, to the outsider, Nielsen just seems like this big blob, you know, like Nielsen. But we actually do quite a bit. And a lot of really neat research. We focus primarily on media research. And when you think about media, there's a lot of different pieces of that pie. Of course, there's audience, right? We measure audiences, what audiences consume when it comes to content, how much time, what type of devices they use, all of that. We also, through a recent acquisition with Gracenote, are measuring content. And what I mean by measuring content, it's not from the audience perspective of how many eyeballs are on that content, but what is the DNA of content that helps us understand how content is selected, or what is it within content that's driving the selection. So think of all the metadata pieces that make a piece of content, and then the audience is watching that content. So there's sort of the two major things. We also measure the third thing is the outcomes, right? So what happens when people, you know, see brands within content, or when brands are presented in a way where audiences can then change their behavior or purchase that brand, engage with it as a result of what they've seen. So, you know, at a very high level, Nielsen is a media research company, and we focus on researching what consumers watch, but also what it is about the content that makes it watchable. And then, of course, the outcomes of that. The other thing we do on the side, and this is where I focus, is social and economic research. And people don't often think we do that, or they don't know, but part of the reason we do social and economic research is we want to bring forward to brands and marketers and community organizations the stories of these unique consumer sets. So today you and I are talking about Hispanic consumers or Spanish language consumers, wherever they are from. I don't want to, Hispanic is sometimes attached to US Hispanics or Latinos per se, where Spaniards from Spain, you know, often considered European. So I don't want to separate in that way. I want to think about a Spanish speaking consumer. And so my role in our social and economic research is to really understand this Spanish speaking consumer and all of the dimensions of culture that influences consumer to make decisions, and share that decision-making pathway with brands so that they can, you know, they can make better decisions how they want to reach out to this consumer, with what product, through what media, etc.
Wonderful. And what is the influence of the family connections in the marketing, particularly in the multicultural communities?
So we call that collectivist culture. And part of the work that I do is whenever we start seeing differences in how people, behave in, for example, Spanish-speaking consumers to non-Spanish-speaking consumers, we asked ourselves the question, well, why, right? Why would this woman, this Cubana, have different purchasing and behavior patterns than this, non-Hispanic white woman? Like, why, what's different? And as we start to do more of our social and economic research, we start to recognize the importance that culture has to play in our decision-making process and our path to purchase. So we call that collectivist culture. I didn't invent the term, but social.
And what that means, just.
I'll tell you about it. Social psychologists for a very long time have understood that there are things that occur in our natural habitat, so our upbringing and our connections as we are, within our own individual cultures that influence how we behave. So as an example, in generally speaking, among Spanish language cultures, their collectivism is common. And that means that we rely on each other. We rely on our families heavily, and more so than we see in other cultures. And what I mean by rely on is I'm not necessarily speaking of like a support system for, resources or finances. I'm talking about a close-knit connection that helps us define who we are and how we see others. And for the Hispanic community, it's very, or generally speaking, Spanish language communities, is a very close culture where, familial responsibilities are very important. They are valued and they're taken into consideration in a way that we don't see in individualist cultures. And so it was important for us to really understand how the social psychology behind collectivist cultures, so that when we see things like word of mouth among Spanish-speaking people, we see that word of mouth transfers ideas and brand suggestions and recommendations very quickly in this community, and they're relied upon heavily, and they become really more than just a recommendation. This is like a trusted source of information in a way that we don't see in other communities. So the more we understand these individual social behaviors, the better we can understand, brands can understand not just how to influence them, because I think that sounds, perhaps somewhat prescribed, but really how to best serve those needs, right? If we know that family and connection is important, that helps us think about the creative that we put together. That helps us think about storylines that are meaningful in the novellas that we love, right? It helps us develop everything from content to ads to products if we understand what's important to this community.
No, makes total sense. And just to conclude, what will be the trends for 2021? I'm sure you could share with us some of the trends that you could just give us a little hint.
Well, I think there's a lot, there's a lot, but if we're going to focus just on media, one of the things that I think will be one of the most important trends is an increase in options and selections. So we've already seen, in particular, when you look at different Latin American countries, when you look at Spain, Argentina, or Mexico, we have seen that there is this increase in consumption of content outside of traditional terrestrial television. So if you broadcast television and cable, people are getting their content from what we call SVOD, which is subscription video on demand, or IPTV. It's called different places in different countries, but they're increasingly getting their content from providers outside of broadcasting cable. That has a couple of implications. One of them that I think is interesting is right now in Spain in particular, about 24% of all of the broadcast stations in Spain are public, compared to the US, where it's a little less than 10%. So what that means is that you're looking at about a quarter of all of the stations that are public or sort of government run, and 3/4 that are not. So the availability of content that is unique and distinct, separate from public-owned stations, is really only 3/4 of the market, which is one of the reasons why I think a lot of that content will continue to grow in other spaces like IPTV. It also allows more diverse stories to be told, right? Every country, regardless, of where you're at in particular is grappling to some degree with racial equity and with really recognizing indigenous communities. Spain is one of those countries that has a number of different dialects that are spoken, which is one of the reasons, by the way, that about 24% of total broadcast is still public, because there's different dialects that are managed within regions. But that also means that as every country is really thinking through what diversity looks like for them and giving voice to the voiceless, that more content that features stories from indigenous populations, from other community groups that aren't typically sort of front and center, there's going to be more space for that type of content in IPTV, subscription video on demand, and other places, because the marketplace is pretty much already distinguished, as we just talked about. So that's in particular, for Spain, but we see that also with Mexico and with Argentina, where there are, indigenous communities that are now being given the opportunity to have more voice and content. But the space for that content will be in alternative spaces initially, because that's where, and people will seek that content, they will consume that content. And just as it has in the US, the voice for that content will grow. People increasingly want to see diverse stories and more diverse people, regardless of where you live, right? And that often, these alternative providers really open the opportunity for that. In fact, I just saw a statistic, and I don't know if I have it right here with me, but I can tell you essentially one of the things that we saw is that year over year, when we looked at the last 4 years of data, we've seen that increasingly, actually, this is a US statistic, but I'm sure it's not too different anywhere around the world, that terrestrial and broadcast is shrinking, and these other alternative avenues for content are increasing, meaning people are less and less having broadcast television in their homes, and they're opting just to sort of cut the cord and go entirely for a digital content distributed through different providers. So I really think, in a way, I wouldn't say that this is a bad thing for broadcaster or cable providers. There's a lot of opportunity, and a lot of their content is being distributed in other platforms. I think, generally speaking, it is audiences making choices about the type of content that's attractive to them and where they can receive that content. So it's eye-opening, but it's for sure an opportunity. So that's one trend I see. That was a big sentence for a big trend. The other trend I see is in average daily viewing time. So people in the US, generally speaking, the countries I've been talking about here, the US, Spain, Argentina, Mexico, generally speaking, for total adults consuming about the same number of minutes daily in content. But what I did see, though, is that's overall, that's pretty much the same for everyone. It's anywhere between like 3.5 and 4 minutes, 4 minutes and 12 seconds, or generally speaking. I'm sorry, hours. Pardon me, we should fix that. Can I?
Yeah, no worries. Hours, yes.
Okay. All right. Sorry. Pardon me. Per day. But one trend. Well, I'm just going to restate it to make sure we're clear. So, generally speaking, people are consuming in all of these countries about between 3.5 and 4 hours of content, give or take. But one of the things that we do see is that while that may be true for overall people, for young adults, so think 18 to 24. Although that demo varies a little bit in other countries. In Spain, it's 15 to 25. But generally speaking, for older adults, we've seen either the increase hasn't been as great year to year from 2019 forward, or what we've seen is a decline, as we see in Mexico. So that tells me a couple of things. It tells me that content developers and broadcasters and others really need to focus on the attention of our young adults. Their attention right now is being pulled away from traditional television content and programming and moving elsewhere, right? Whether perhaps it's gaming, perhaps it's social media, but some of that attention that was really fixed on television, we've seen a little bit of a decline. So what I do foresee is broadcasters, content developers, and others really focusing in on their content delivery, focused particularly for younger consumers, because this is the space, this is the next big consumer. And while we know people are diversifying their consumption of content across more platforms, we do want to ensure that there's still finding the value in television programming.
Beautiful. Well, thank you so much. For me, it has been an amazing educational experience to speaking with you today. And I'm sure for a lot of viewers also will be the same. And I really want to thank you for your generosity sharing with us all of this information today, Stacy.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for having me. And you can find me online on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn. I'm happy to answer any questions or bring forward any additional data.
Much.